So I'm here this afternoon. It's VE Day, or at least it's the VE Bank Holiday, the 75th anniversary here in the UK. And I'm here with my mum and my dad. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to get them just to introduce themselves with their name. I'm going to ask you when you were born in terms of which year and where you were born, because I think that would be that's the whole point of this, and just how old you were at the end of the Second World War. So let's starting with Dad. Just introduce yourself on those terms.
I'm John Old. I'm Peter's father, and I was born in 1934 in Leeds, England.
Cool. And Mum?
And I'm Karin Old. I'm John's wife. I'm Peter's mother, and I was born Karin Kirchschlager in November 1940 in a small market town in Austria called Bad Aussee.
Cool. So Dad, that would make you how old at the end of the war?
Well, I was 11 at the end of the war.
Okay. And I was four and a half.
You were 4 and a half. In completely different sides, as it were, in completely different environments. And that's kind of why we're doing this, just to kind of do a compare and contrast for a married couple 75 years after the end of the war. So Dad, just in your own words, tell us about your experience of the end of the war. If you can remember anything specific about VE Day itself, that would be brilliant, but just in general.
Well, on VE Day, I in fact was at school in a place called Arnside on the west coast of England. We had very little of a celebration at school, so much so that I cannot remember anything specific. But the one thing I do remember about not only just then, but the whole of the war, was that there was a magazine published in England called the Illustrated London News, a very famous photo journal of life, not only in England, but of throughout the empire, as it then was, and it started sometime in the late 19th century, and full of photographs of life at the time all over the world. And in particular, the time that I remember was, of course, during the war. And exactly the first thing I do remember about it is that in 1941, they had the whole story of the sinking of HMS Hood. Mm-hmm. And all through the war, we got this magazine. I remember the El Alamein photos of the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa. But specifically to do with VE Day, I remember it being called VE Day, of course, and we were told about how it was the end of the war as we knew it. Well, of course, we did know a little about what was going on in the Far East, the war against Japan, but we had only just been allowed in late 1944 to travel outside our basically home area, so that most of my life, which wasn't spent at school, was spent in Leeds, in and around Leeds, and we didn't have a car in those days. We'd had a car, a Ford V8, pre-war, and we got a car, in fact, again in 1946. A small Ford Prefect, as I remember, which just managed to climb up Garraby Hill on the way to Bridlington. We were allowed to go to Bridlington for the first time since the start of the war in 1944. We couldn't go to the family house in Bridlington because that was occupied by the RAF, who housed a couple of officers and their wives there. Both of them were commanders of the air sea rescue boats, which were stationed at Bridlington Harbour. We didn't get back into the house until 1946, as I remember, maybe even slightly later than that.
So
going back to,
if we focus in on sort of May 1945 and the end of the war in Europe. So you were at boarding school.
I was at boarding school on the west coast of England.
What was the sense? I mean, obviously you were 11 years old. You're about the same age that my oldest boy is now. What was the sense? Was it victorious, jubilation? Was it relief? Was it sadness? What was the sense for you and for the adults around you?
I am sure that for the adults around us at school, and also at home, it must have been a great sense of relief, and I think great sense of relief more than anything else, rather than rejoicing, because we'd just, as I know now, we'd just come through an absolutely horrendous time so far as our parents were concerned, of what had happened. My father was too old and had such bad eyesight that he couldn't join the forces. But what he did was he joined what was then called the National Fire Service. All the fire people who were in fact mostly spent dealing with the Blitz damage and the fires and things. Well, he used to parade about 4 times a week at the local fire station, where they just waited there until they got called out to go and fight fires. Leeds was very fortunate. It had a Royal Ordnance Factory, tank factory, and which was at the other side of the city to where we lived. And try as they might, the Germans couldn't find it. So any bombs we got, and we had 1 week of sort of so-called blitz, but nothing like our nearest large town, Sheffield, which had a quite horrendous blitz in the 40-41 period, because all the steel industry was situated in the east end of Sheffield, and they tried very hard to totally wipe it out. Unfortunately for them, they missed. Instead, they hit the centre of the city, the shops and places.
Do you remember the bombing in Leeds at all, or were you away at the time?
When I was at home in Leeds, I remember the bombs. We had an air raid shelter in our back garden, which was dug into the ground.
So that was an Anderson style?
I don't think so. I'm not quite sure what it was. But all I know, it was a hole in the ground, and it had some bunks put into it.
Okay.
And we, that is to say, my brother Martin and I, when the sirens went, were carried down into the shelter. Well, my mother, after about a week of every night going down into the shelter, decided that was enough. So we didn't even bother going into the shelter.
Okay.
We just turned over and went back to sleep as
Okay.
children.
And in terms of VE Day itself, you were at school. Did you do anything special? For example, did you get to stay up to listen to Churchill or the King if he was on the radio or anything like that? Or was it just was it marked in any way?
Not that I can remember. I'm sure it was, but I can't remember anything particular about it. We wouldn't have heard the King, nor for that matter Churchill, because it was after bedtime.
Okay.
Yeah. Rules were rules and had to be kept.
Is there anything else that you remember about immediately after the war? Because obviously you were in the middle of rationing. You've talked a bit about the travel restrictions were being lifted. Do you remember anything else about that 1945? Anything?
Well, in 1945, we were still being rationed. Everything. If I remember rightly, we were allowed an extra sweet ration.
You got an extra sweet ration.
Yeah.
So you celebrated victory in Europe with some extra gobstoppers.
Yes, we did. We boys did. Yes.
Okay.
But apart from that, I really cannot. Oh, one thing I do remember was sort of daftness which children get up to. We had a spy as one of our teachers. He was an Irishman and had been a teacher all his adult life. But being an Irishman, because some of them were extremely suspicious of people, and we always called him the spy. But he was a very nice, he was an old man by then. He was, he seemed an old man to us.
I thought this was going to be far more exciting. And just in terms of the last thing I'm going to ask you before I switch to Mum is, in terms of your parents, as you said, your father was too old to serve and his eyesight was too bad, so he served in the fire service. Was your mum doing anything for the war effort at all?
Nothing, not as far as I can. As far as I can remember. Oh, I know what she was doing. One thing she did was, well, first of all, we had two British soldiers billeted on us in 1940-41. I only remember the name of one. He was Philip, and I think he was an RAF guy. Why he was billeted on us, I don't know, but he was for a short period. But the other thing I do remember is my mother got all her friends to knit socks for the army, because right at the very beginning, they were scratching around for every bit of clothing to supply the troops. I mean, if you remember, after Dunkirk, the troops came back and all they got left was what they wore. And all their spare uniforms and kit, underwear and shirts and socks and boots and everything, of course, all lost to the Germans. Well, I'm trying to think what else there was that I can remember.
No, so it's
as I say, my mother got now this is a funny story. My mother got every one of her friends to knit socks. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the first evening, when she got them all knitting socks, she supplied the wool and the needles, and they spent about 2 hours it was a Thursday evening, spent about 2 hours, and at the end of it, they all tried to leave the half-finished socks behind. And my mother said, "You can't do that." And so they said, "Why not?" Just because I'm left-handed and you're all right-handed. You've knitted everything right-handedly. I can't do that, so you have to take them home and finish the job.
So I think what I wanted to draw out, because Mum knows why I'm making this point. You for all of the war, even though some of it you spent away at school, but you came back. Your parents were at home in the war. You grew up with your parents at home. So I'm going to switch to Mum now. And Mum, you were 4.5 at the end of the war. And obviously it's a slightly different memory, and you may not remember anything specifically about VE Day itself, but it certainly wasn't Victory Day where you grew up. So I wonder if you could just talk us through your memory of the end of the war.
Well, there was no victory, was there? And people were still very poor, very hungry, very disillusioned, very divided. And I remember two things. One, well, they're connected actually. My father was at that time in America, an American prisoner of war in Texas. And Austria was split into various zones for 10 years. And one day we went to look on the road. I can't remember the circumstances, but the main road was not far from us. There were no cars on the road where I lived. Nobody had a car. And there the Americans were marching in. And the first thing that really struck me was that there were some Negroes amongst them. I'd never ever seen a black person. I've never ever seen, I knew Chinese from picture books, but I'd never seen a black man. And I know I had mixed emotions. I was sort of scared, unsure how to react. But, you know, that was that. They then marched on into the center of the small town, which was, 15 minutes away from where we were, 20 minutes. And then one day I went out. Of course, at 4.5, I wasn't allowed to go out on my own. I went out with somebody in the family. And in the center, on the square, there were some big, imposing buildings, and one of them had a cafe with huge picture windows. There were the American soldiers sitting in their full uniform with their feet on the table. And that was horrendous, because we were brought up to mark our P's and Q's, to mind them, to sit straight, to eat in a very dignified manner, and things like feet on the floor, on the table, that just did not happen. And it really shocked me.
Wow.
And Austria was very, very formal at the time, and of course the Americans weren't.
That was Lewandowski.
They were chewing gum. Pardon?
That was Lewandowski, right in the middle.
Yeah, it was then Lewandowski, and then it was Meindl, and now it's something else.
And do you remember the day that the Americans drove into Bad Arsir? Because obviously it was the valley was actually a place in the salt mines where the Nazis hid a lot of the stolen stuff, and there's a lot of interesting history there. Do you remember?
Yeah, but they didn't know it. That nobody knew at the time. I think some people did know, but everybody was just scared to open their mouths. You didn't ask questions. No, you didn't. It's none of your business. And only years later, when I asked my mother, she said, "Of course I couldn't tell you anything, because that was relating to something else, because if they'd found out, I would have disappeared and had 3 children. I couldn't risk my life and leave you behind." And so I grew up in a culture of you don't ask questions.
And in terms of obviously you were at home with your mother, my grandmother, and
many others.
And many others, yes. Because you grew up in the Lutheran, in the vicarage, so there were always people coming through.
Yeah, we also, it's not just the people coming through. We had my father's best man. He was also in the war, but his wife came from Vienna with her 2 children. And my mother's cousin, the Rinas, they were there with their child. So there were actually 6 children under the age of 6 on 3 floors with one little Primus stove, which heated the very cold, big Victorian house, and where we also cooked 3 families, you know, thinking back. But we had a very, apart from that, we had a very carefree childhood because we could roam around, you know, in the woods, and we played with the neighbors, and, you know, it was quite a carefree time.
I understand that the winter of 1945 to 1946 was particularly hard after the end of the war, and obviously that was before your father was back from the war. We'll talk about that
Yes.
shortly. Do you
Yes.
want to just tell us a little bit about that? Just as things in Britain were beginning, you know, you got the extra sweet ration that Dad spoke about. What was that first year like after the end of the war?
It was cold. It was bitterly cold, and we had no heating. There was sort of condensation running down the walls on the staircase. We played by sliding down the banisters and keep ourselves warm. I remember that. And we had no food. In the spring and summer, we collected dandelion leaves and nettles and things, but we had split peas, which had grubs in them, very old, made soup from them, made vegetable from them, made baked bread from them, you know, horrendous. We had some cheese. I remember a block of orange cheese. Now, Austrian cheese isn't like that at all, but it was a solid block of cheese which came from Denmark, but it was lovely. It was lovely to have it. And then we had chickens. So,
Yes.
but that was after the war. Mm-hmm. And yeah, provided us with the much loved chicken soup, because they laid eggs first, and when they weren't able to do that anymore, they went into the pot.
You spoke about the Americans coming into the valley, and then going and seeing them in the cafe with their feet up. Was it always the Americans, or did they eventually swap out for a different occupying force?
We always had the Americans. In Leoben, where my mother comes from, they had the Russians, and my grandmother, great-grandmother, and my great-aunt, and my other relations who were there, my mother's brother, had to leave. They were forced out of their house, and the Russians weren't there, and the house had to be pulled down afterwards. It was in such a state. It was horrendous. And I remember, I didn't see them, but I remember when they came, I just saw some men coming or something, and it was uniforms, and we hid. And I hid behind the bins, and there were lots of strawberries there. I remember I pinched them, and I was just scared to death. And then I was off back home.
This was at your grandmother's house?
This was just after the war, at my
Leoben.
great-grandmother's.
Yeah, which was the Russian zone then.
Yeah, that was the Russian zone. And of course, after the war, they were still there for 10 years.
Yeah, and
my paternal grandmother was in Vienna. And on one occasion, I think it was a medical visit or something, I went to Vienna with my mother. And near Linz, there was a checkpoint, St. Valentin, and the Russians came, because that's where the Russian zone started. And they looked at you, and people were scared stiff, because some would just disappear for no reason. You had to show your papers, and you were either allowed to carry on or you disappeared. You know, it's a scary time.
Yeah, absolutely scary.
Yeah.
Do you remember what the worst thing was in that first year after the end of the war? I mean, you've spoken about the cold house. I remember there's this very famous, isn't there? Very famous. The Prime Minister of Austria makes a Christmas address on the radio, and he basically says, in the Christmas 1945, I have nothing to offer you. I have no coal for your hearth. I have no bread for your stomachs. The only thing that I have is hope. You know, hope on this Austria.
Yeah.
What was the worst thing in that first year after the war?
You know, as far as food goes, we just didn't have any. We starved. I was as thin as bones and skin and bones. And of course, lots of us to this day have problems with digestion, but it was just cold. I remember my friend Annemie next door, they went in the same shelter as we did, but that was steer cellar cut into the mountain. So we'd just go down the little path and we go in there and the water was dripping. She had pneumonia. The water was dripping. She was sitting there. We spent the whole night there, sitting on the ground, you know, things like that. You always remember them.
Do you remember the beginning of martial aid in 1946?
I remember that we were allowed to go to the cinema, and there was this big speech about the Marshall Plan. I have no idea what it was all about, except for snippets, little snippets, because I was still very young. And remember, I'd never been allowed to listen to the radio except for music, classical music. And so going to the cinema was fantastic, you know. And we heard, I did actually then hear about the end of the war in the cinema on the screen. And I know the voice is in my ears, a very strong voice, a sort of very English, if you like the English talk when I first came to England, and strong voices and full of hope and full of what we're going to do for you and the rest of it. Yeah, I remember that.
Okay.
The Marshall Plan.
Super. And when did you first have sweets or things like that after the war?
I do not remember having sweets at all, at any time. My mother used to bake some sort of biscuits, but only at Christmas, and they were hanging on the tree, and they were strictly rationed. Except that on Boxing Day one year, they just disappeared, the bottom layer, and underneath the tree lay my youngest brother, fast asleep, satisfied. And then we had some visitors. We always had people coming and going in our house. We had some visitors, Americans, and it must be well into the late 40s, and they brought bananas. I hadn't a clue what a banana was. Never seen a banana in my life. And you can peel it and eat it. I said, I don't think so. But I did try, and you know.
It's a very different experience.
Very. And I think they also brought sweets, if I remember right. But it was the late 40s, 47.
Oh, wow. Okay.
48.
And finally, obviously, Dad grew up in the war with his parents. You were probably 2 years old when my grandfather, your father, was conscripted.
Not even that, I don't think.
Do you remember him? No. Before the war. So tell me about your first memory of your father.
The first memory of my father was in 46, 8th of May, never forget. He came from the war, haggard, dark, very dark color. Remember, he was in the cotton fields in Texas picking cotton. And he'd come, and I looked at him with suspicion. I didn't know at first he was my father. And I had left a very, very independent life. Nobody bothered what I was doing very much. And, you know, with all these kids around, there was my sister and the rest were boys. And you know, we just grew up together and had fun and what have you. And I did what I wanted to do, more or less. And there was this man who laid down the law. And I didn't even like a stranger in the house sitting there. You know, my father, what's a father? Most people, most children didn't have a father. Most of them never came home from the war. When I started school, people didn't have fathers. There were about a handful out of 40 who had fathers. And he was there, and my sister sat on one of his knees, well, not, yeah, and my younger brother on the other one. There were 3 of us at that point. And I didn't want to know. I thought, no, I don't want that stranger who's telling me what to do and go over there and do that. And I thought, no, it was all right as it was before. I don't know why I should change now. It was not good. It was terrible, you know. I just wanted To be honest, I wanted my father to be gone.
I think it's very poignant. I think very poignant what you said. Most of the kids that you were at school with didn't have fathers.
No.
And you can still go now. You can go to the military graveyards, and it's just rows upon rows in that little town of dead people. And I think I mean, you know, here in Britain we talk about the losses in the war, but actually, the number of dead in the Second World War in terms of armed is just a few 100,000. And I think across Germany and Austria, we're talking upwards to 10 million dead in the war. Something else.
Yeah.
And actually, 8th of May, so that would be 74 years ago today when he came back.
8th of May, 1946.
Yeah, 74 years ago today. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. I just wanted to get all that down on camera, and I just wanted to capture that as much as VE Day on one side was a day of celebration and extra sweets, even if you didn't have a party, Dad, actually there's another side to the story. There are ordinary families who actually had a really hard time at that time.
Yeah, and you know, Peter, it has marked the generation. It took, I think it took, for me, it took 40, 50 years to shake it off.
Wow. Yeah. And do you think marrying Dad and coming to live in the UK in the very late 60s and being in Britain in the 70s as part of that process?
Yes.
Do you see amongst your contemporaries who stayed in Austria slightly different attitudes to the war?
I first came to England after I'd done my equivalent of the A-levels, and I didn't know what to do really. I wanted to do languages, but I wasn't sure how to go about it, and I didn't have Latin, and. My father had other ideas, but I finally decided, you know, they gave in and let me come into England for a year. Did actually stay 18 months. And when I came here, I thought, this is wonderful. This is just fantastic. England was just coming out of the poverty. It was just starting to finish rationing a few years previously. And the attitude to life and everything was so positive. Whereas even in the late 50s, Austria was still negative, very negative, and very class-ridden. You think of English classes, well, you haven't lived in Austria at that time. You couldn't get anywhere without knowing the right people. Yeah.
Here we are 75 years later.
For me, it's been life-changing, you know, and as you know, I've worked all over the place after that. And when I came back, to work in England, it was just liberating. It's lovely. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. It's been amazing to hear your stories. And it's just good to get them down as a matter of social record on the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fine.
Ich kann euch zu Weihnachten nichts geben. Ich kann euch für den Christbaum, wenn ihr überhaupt einen habt, keine Kerzen geben, kein Stück Brot, keine Kohle zum Heizen, kein Glas zum Einschneiden. Wir haben nichts. Ich kann euch nur bitten, glaubt an dieses Österreich.